So I'm here with Paul Knox and we're going to talk about stems today. I've had a few people discuss particular stems where they couldn't get them to tighten up enough to lock their handlebars into place, and I figured, well, we haven't done a tech talk with you yet.
No.
And if anyone knew how to do up a stem properly to make sure the handlebars aren't going to move, it'd be you, because I've never seen any of your handlebars move at any of your crashes.
No, and with most modern stems, the likelihood of the bar moving is really slight. Most modern stems grip so tight that as long as they're done upright, your bars just aren't going to move.
And manufacturers are going to make the stems hoping that everyone will do them up properly. So what we'll do is we'll show people the right technique, but before that we'll talk a little bit about stems. I mean, I've noticed that you run it's a profile acoustic, so it's a front-loading stem very much like this one. What made you choose that stem over all the others?
Going by bar height, with a front-loader stem, generally you have either a slightly negative drop or your bars are dead level. Because I'm running the OS 20, I'm using a standard 20-inch bar. So a standard 20-inch bar done up with a front loader stem. In the case of the acoustic, it's got a slight drop in it, so that compensates for the extra height in the front end. Generally, most people these days will run a top loader stem. With a top loader, basically they generally have a rise height of anywhere from 20 to about 28 millimeters. So that allows you to drop your stem low down onto the top of your headset. Less spaces underneath, less possibility of flex, but you still get the height.
So there was a bit of a trend a while back for people to stack heaps and heaps of spaces under their stem. I don't do that. I refuse to put my steerer tube under that kind of load. If you saw someone do that, what would you say to them?
Generally say to them if they had a look into a top loader. The limiting factor on a lot of the top loaders were a lot of the older top loaders, basically the show with that, were a dead flat stem that just had a base plate on top. So your difference between your front loader and your top loader a few years ago was more adhesives more than anything else, whether you wanted to have your bolts at the front or your bolts at the top. Bolts at the top are easier to do up when you've got your number plate on to check the tightness. Bolts at the front are easier to do up when you're assembling the bike. With modern top loaders though, what they generally have now is the body of the stem itself will have a rise built into it. Like I was saying, most of your stems these days, it's very rare to find one that's got less than a 20mm rise, and most of them are up around 25 to 28. That gets rid of about that much of spaces under a stem.
So if someone was already running a top load stem, they felt like they needed a bit of extra handlebar height, and they started stacking up their spaces underneath, at what point would you suggest that maybe they should look at, say, taller handlebars instead of more spaces?
I wouldn't go much over 20mm. In stack of spaces. If you have a look at two 10mm spaces on top of each other, it doesn't sound like much. It looks a lot when it's on a bike. Every bit of extra leverage higher on the steerer tube just gives you that little bit more flex when you're on the gate.
So we've got a couple of different stems here, both obviously front loader stems. We've got the mini it's a VSR stem, which I got for Ripley when we first set up her bike, and it has Torx bolts, whereas the S&M stem has a standard 6mm steel hex Allen key bolts. What's the difference between the two types of bolts, and why would you use one over the other?
I have no idea.
I did look into it a little bit, and it's supposed to be better purchase, and you won't round out your bolts anywhere near as fast, because obviously say in this case the 6mm Allen key, which is this one here, may not be perfectly 6mm in here, and after a little bit of tightening and adjusting over the years, it kind of rounds out a little bit.
Yep.
but you don't get the rounding out with the torque bolt. Gee, the guru of BMX didn't know about torque bolts.
No, I just never use them.
Oh yeah. So I found it a little bit difficult to get the torque wrench in there because it doesn't sit in quite as far as an Allen key would into a hex bolt. But once I got used to it, it was fine. And like you were saying before, you don't need quite as much leverage on a smaller stem because there's less, I guess, torque on the any time around a BMX track, even on the gate. So yeah, it was pretty interesting that the smaller stems from VSR, and I think I've seen a couple of others come with this torque Allen key.
Well, you shouldn't, especially with the smaller kids, which will have a tendency to run a carbon bar or a thin wall alloy bar. You really don't want too much torque on it, so a small torque wrench like that is perfect. And in fact, even with a pro size stem, S&M a few years ago used to specifically come with a 1/4 inch Allen key that was only that long. Now, the reason for that was the amount of torque that you could get, even with the short Allen key, they determined that was enough to actually stop your bars from having any movement. If you're getting to the point of where you've got, you can get Allen keys, you can get ones with about almost 20 odd centimetre of handle on. If you've got that much leverage on the bolt that you're going like this, chances are you're actually compressing your bar and ovalizing it slightly. Once that happens, your bars actually slip if they're not perfectly round. So sometimes it can be counteractive. The more you tighten it, the more slip you're actually going to get out of your bars.
All right, so I have noticed, and we talked about this earlier, that people don't quite get the idea of tightening up their stem clamp quite right, and then they end up with some slippage. Do you want to tell us how the best way is to sort of get your handlebars in there and get them nice and tight and so they're not slipping?
Yeah, well, this is, once again, this comes back to the amount of clamping force you can get onto it. Now, what you ideally want is for it to clamp up perfectly square. So you want the same amount of pressure to be evenly applied right the way through the bar to hold it into place. Now, the best way to do that is you get your bar into position, push your cap back, check it from the side, make sure you've got the same gaps evenly all the way around. Do your Allen keys up till your bars are set. Maybe not do them up totally tight, just allow for that little bit of, just get that feel, make sure it's in the right place. Now the important part is, when they are in the right place, don't just crank each bolt down hard. You do that, you start pulling uneven pressures on the bar. So what you want to do is maybe a half of a turn in a figure 8 format. So you start at that bolt there, move to that one, to that one, to that one, back to that one, and over and over. That way you'll get an even torque right the way across the bars. Once the cap is sitting in flush and done up tight, your bars just aren't going to move. Stems are generally made of a slightly softer grade of aluminium to allow them to bite into the bars. Even if they haven't got knurling on them, the aluminium will bite into a chromoly bar. It's very rare to find a bar these days that hasn't got some sort of knurling on it. Disclaimer on that is some of the heavily powder coated bars, especially the white ones, they over powder coat them. If you look at your bars and the powder coating is so thick that you can't actually see the knurling pattern on them, that when you do it down tight, chances are you're going to crush the powder coat. That'll turn into like a fine powder. Your bars aren't going to grip too much. In that case, what you can do is just get a bit of sandpaper and just take off a bit of the powder coat on the bars themselves. You don't have to go overboard and take them down to bare metal or anything like that, just so that the knurling is apparent. The other thing to watch for with clamping them down as well, this is especially if you're running a carbon bar, that is where it is really important to get that torque right. With a carbon bar, if you start pulling it down unevenly, if you get it pulled off to a side a little bit and you go in through that gel coat, then your bar's gonna, well, basically be gone. It'll start to crash and everything like that. And of course, if you're using a carbon bar, don't forget to use carbon paste in your bar as well. But
so
once again,
what does the carbon paste do?
Carbon paste, it's like basically almost like a gritty adhesive. So as you put the pressure on it, it binds to both the bar and the clamp itself, and just stops it from moving, because carbon bars do have that gel coat surface on it. But once again, that's something that's really important, is the torque on those. You don't want to crash through a gel coat. If they're done up correctly, they won't move. And so if you imagine how brittle a gel coat actually is, if you can do up a gel coated carbon bar tight enough that it doesn't slip, you don't have to really go too much tighter than that to do up a chromoly bar. If you do over tighten your bars and you get to the point where the bar starts to slightly overlies, it is never going to stay. Once they start to overlies, that's it, unfortunately.
So with new stems, I've noticed that a lot of the bolts come dry. I always manage to take them off, put a bit of grease on them, put them back in again to make it easier later on to remove and adjust and everything else. Are there any other tips that you would add for a new stem? Is there anything else you would do? Maybe, I don't know, clean out any grease that might be in the steerer or anything like that?
No, generally the steerer, once it's done up, a slight bit of grease there just to slide it on. Once those back ones are done up, it's going to stay. The good point on the grease on the bolt, and where that is really important, is if you get a stem with chrome plated bolts. You put a bit of torque onto a chrome plated bolt, the chrome can actually flake slightly. You get a bit of flaking chrome inside an alloy stem, and I've had a couple that have done that, where basically I've had to hacksaw through the bolts to get them off. Once that bit of chrome flakes off the bolt and gets embedded in the thread of the stem, it's not moving.
This is a CNC stem. This one is too. CNC is considered high-end with overcasting, a lot more expensive process. So obviously the cost of the stem's higher. Does that mean that there's a better quality stem when you're buying a CNC stem? Is it bang for buck?
Generally it is. With a cast stem, basically taking molten metal, pouring it into a mould and relying on metal being strong enough to hold up. With a CNC'd stem, they start off with a billet of aluminium, so that's already done to a specific tolerance, cutting away all the extra bits you don't need. And so you wind up you're starting off with a much superior material, and you wind up with a better stem at the end of it. The other variation of that is cold forged stems, which we are starting to see a few more of in BMX. They were actually quite popular back in the 80s, then slowly faded away as CNC machines became more prevalent. With a forged stem, the manufacturers will actually start out with a block of aluminium and use high pressured forges that will actually squash and push the stem into place. What that does is it basically aligns almost the grains as it was inside the metal, makes them incredibly strong. So there are a few on the market now that you'll see where they say they're forged and CNC'd. So what they'll do is they'll forge it into the basic shape, then CNC off all the extra parts. Very costly procedure to set up the forges and everything to start with, but you do wind up with an incredibly strong stem that can also be very light once you've cut away all the bits that you don't need.
I can't remember if we touched on this earlier, but titanium bolt upgrades, what are your thoughts on those?
I use titanium bolt upgrades on mine, primarily to stop rusty bolts.
Yeah.
I'm not too fussed on, it saves weight. If you're into weight savings, yeah, it does save a lot of weight. Titanium is a very stretchy material, so in a lot of cases titanium isn't actually that suitable for some bolts. However, with stems, like I said, BMX as a whole have a tendency to way over tighten things, but in a stem, tie bolts will hold up to the purpose, no problems.
So if people don't know how tight they should tighten their stems, is it worthwhile using torque wrenches, or do you think it's rule of thumb, just go until it feels like it's too tight?
Torque wrenches are the ideal way, except even with a lot of the high-end stems don't come with torque ratings. There are quite a few now that are, but your general rule of thumb is even this is a lot of leverage.
Yeah.
If you just get your basic 6mm or quarter inch long Allen key that's generally about that long or a little bit more, if you can hold it in your hand, that's the torque that you should get. If you get to the point where you can't move that anymore in the figure 8, that's your bars locked.
Alright, well what I'll do is I'll go grab the other bike and we'll talk about tightening up the VSR fat mouth, which is a slightly different setup. Okay Paul, so we've got the VSR fat mouth stem here, which is a slightly different setup. Do you want to tell us about that one?
Yeah, this is a variation on your traditional top loader stems in that it doesn't do up with a flush plate like a lot of the other stems that we were looking at earlier. What happened with these ones, it clamps absolutely flush at the back. So you put your bar on, you drop your top cap down, and you do up your two back plates tight. Once the back plates are done up tight, and you do those bolts right up, then you simply do the two front ones, alternating backwards and forwards, still getting that kind of equal torque. Now the idea there, and the CXP stem uses the same principle, as does a couple of Fit Bike Co stems, although they use a front clamping system, is that by having it dead flush and by using some really precision machining, you get more contact patch right around the bar. So once that's done up tight, your full contact of the bar runs all the way around. Then the front bit does the actual clamping. So it's only a small amount of extra contact around the bar, but because it's so evenly pulled around the whole bar surface itself, it should reduce your chances of slipping even more.
So that's pretty new to BMX. Why do you think it's taken so long for that style of stem to catch on?
I'm not sure. It's been used in the motocross world for quite a while. A lot of the motocross bikes have that system where it clamps dead flush on either front or back end and then does up with the two bolts. Because BMX has a lot of trickle down from road and mountain biking, and not so much from motocross, although that was our roots, and maybe that's why it's taken that little bit longer.
Alright, I think that's about it for stems. If anybody has any questions and wants us to show them anything specifically or with a specific stem, maybe get in touch with us either through bmxultra.com or through YouTube, and we'll have a look at it. Thanks very much, Paul, for coming on.
Thank you.
And we'll see everyone soon. Cheers.